Our white clapboarded meeting house, with its tall steeple and shining gold leaf dome, looks like the picture of a New England Christian church. Alas, appearances can be deceiving, and the religious beliefs and activities of the Unitarian Universalist congregation linked to this building might surprise some. Indeed, back when the building was still new, the congregation split over theology. In March 1828, the departing dissenters held their first service at Gleason's store, now known as Kirkside, or the yellow house next door. From that meeting, the Trinitarian Congregational Church formed, which eventually would build a chapel across the street. Nearly 2 centuries later, each congregation still believes differently. Sometimes we make lasting choices as a congregation about the direction we will or will not go. Well, congregations across New England and beyond faced questions about evolving ideas of Christianity. First Parish in Wayland chose to go the way of the Unitarians, the liberal contingent, by embracing the use of reason to critically engage scriptures, as well as by putting those scriptures into conversation with contemporary understandings of science and knowledge. Adherents of the Unitarian faith departed from orthodox understandings of God, Jesus' divinity, and the capacity of the human to learn, to grow, to become better people. While today we might not spend so much time debating the fine points of Christian theological beliefs, the value of freely exploring our own beliefs, using reason, and engaging our contemporary sources of knowledge remains deep in our institutional DNA. On the Universalist side, the preaching of universal salvation had been growing in the second half of the 18th century, such that Universalists were the 9th largest Christian denomination in the US by the 1830s. When Universalism merged with the Unitarians to form the Unitarian Universalist Association, or UUA, in 1961, First Parish in Wayland chose to join this association and become Unitarian Universalist. From the Universalist message of a loving, inclusive God, we receive a broad and deep commitment to inclusivity, a hallmark of our own contemporary aspirations and understandings of who we aim to be as a deeply inclusive, loving community. Over the centuries, First Parish in Wayland has had moments of decision about how our local congregation will respond to wider changes. Such choices not only impact who we are locally, but can also impact the direction of the larger denomination or movement. I believe we are in another one of those moments. Do you feel it? 5 years ago, in the spring of 2017, significant controversy erupted following the hire of a lead for the southern region of the UUA, a white ordained man over a non-ordained woman of color. As the news broke at a gathering of UU religious professionals of color, Aisha Hauser, a religious educator, observed, "I feel like we are at a precipice. Either we are going to be who we say we are, or we will be a country club for white people." That June, the UUA board voted to create a commission on institutional change with the charge to, quote, "work in collaboration with a professional organization capable of conducting an external audit of white privilege and the structure of power within Unitarian Universalism, to analyze structural racism and white supremacy within the UUA. 3 years later, the Commission released their final report, Widening the Circle of Concern. In our reading this morning from the theology section of this report, we heard these words. It can be said that contemporary Unitarian Universalism as lived and as a living tradition has two commitments: freedom of belief and its orientation toward inclusion, interdependence, and justice. These two commitments have shaped our faith tradition in positive ways and also led to some problematic dynamics. In my understanding, the tension between freedom of belief and being held accountable for being who we say we are as an inclusive community creates one of those problematic dynamics. Undeniably, we value freedom of belief. The openness of thinking is what brought many of us here and what keeps us in this faith tradition. And yet, freedom of belief is a value that can sometimes be heard as, I can believe whatever I want, and perhaps even I am free to do and be however I want. Does freedom of belief also mean freedom of action? Does the value of freedom mean that we simply accept whatever behaviors people bring to shared spaces, especially when behaviors have exclusionary or harmful impacts? Or are we accountable to anything more or anyone if what we say or do or fail to say or do harms another? And if yes, to whom or what are we accountable for our behaviors? What might accountability look like? When multiple members of the national leadership resigned in the wake of the 2017 hiring controversy, including then President, these questions of accountability drove change. Not only did those who played a part in the hiring controversy leave, many of the institutions that shape our collective lives were shaken to audit the ways in which presumptions of whiteness as preferred and superior, or white supremacy culture, permeated cultures and practices. 2 weeks ago, on a Saturday, I attended a portion of the virtual board meeting of the UUA. The agenda included discussion on the implementation of the recommendations of the Commission on Institutional Change, including how to institute systems of accountability to historically marginalized groups. What new systems could be built? Should the accountability partners review decisions made by the board, or should they be in the room as the decisions are being made? What power do accountability partners have? Do they receive funding, staff? Now, I know that some of you say, you do not care about what's going on in the UUA over there. But I think it matters a lot because it's also our story. To be a religion based on freedom of belief alone will not sustain us. It will not be an adequate well from which to draw the resources we need to become a more truly inclusive and just community. We also need to be for something and accountable to others and how well we live into our values of inclusivity, interdependence, and justice. If you're familiar with the musical Hamilton, and who isn't? Just kidding. What I'm suggesting is similar to the question Alexander Hamilton puts to Aaron Burr. Throughout the musical, Burr equivocates and obfuscates his feelings and political positions. Direct and pointed in contrast, Hamilton repeatedly asks, "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for?" To choose a side is to also be accountable for the consequences of that commitment. 200 years ago, congregations increasingly face a pointed question. Would they embrace the Unitarian position or retain Trinitarian Orthodox theology? Lawsuits, congregational splits, and bitter feelings ensued. Sometimes decisions need to be made, not only on the level of individual belief, but of congregational commitment. The question becomes, who will we be? When the 2017 hiring controversy spurred change at the national level, it clearly emerged within the context of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, whose origins were traced in the story Three Wise Women, which Alessa read earlier. The racial reckoning called for by the Black Lives Matter movement is not yet done, far from it. The very need for this movement, despite the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the Civil War of the 1860s, shows how pernicious white supremacy culture and structural racism is in our nation. Not to mention that again this week, a 22-year-old Black man, Amir Locke, was shot and killed by police in Minneapolis during an early morning raid with a no-knock warrant. A raid that lasted 10 seconds. On this Sunday, as we recognize Black History Month, my hope is that we recognize that we are now living through an important moment in history. We are being asked the pointed question of what we will do about white supremacy culture. In our nation, yes, but also in our cities and in our congregation. We have options. If you want to join with other UUs from across the country and deepening your personal awareness of racism and white supremacy culture, you can join Alyssa in the multi-session Beloved Conversations virtual program this spring. Thanks to the Lydia Mariah Child Fund, the registration cost is heavily subsidized, or even free if you need that. Just ask Alyssa or myself for more information, and there's also some in the order of service. Or you can join me on Tuesday next week, February 15th at 7 p.m. to learn more about the anti-racism, anti-oppression, multicultural vision that the UUA and congregations like ours are exploring how to live into and implement. For example, the group Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists have proposed an 8th principle that congregations can adopt alongside the existing 7. The 8th principle calls for congregations to promote and affirm, quote, journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions and ourselves and in our institutions. We can explore whether or not to adopt this principle. We can also learn about what it means to establish systems of accountability and transparency throughout our congregation. What are the best practices other congregations follow? For example, the parish committee recently started a process to update our Safe Congregations policy, a document some congregations have expanded beyond the safety of kids to also include a policy for the whole congregation on how to respond to destructive and harmful behaviors. Please let myself, Alyssa, or the parish committee know if you're interested in this work. Listening to that UUA board meeting discuss accountability did feel like a step towards greater spiritual wholeness. When we engage in the work of building the better world we envision, there is joy amidst the struggle. And I don't want this sermon to be one where you log off feeling scolded. My hope is that you instead feel a sense of possibility. There are steps we can take as individuals and as a congregation to actively engage in the work of accountably building a better, more inclusive, less racist and oppressive world, starting right here. This is not a quick fight, nor an easy one. But it is, as the late John Lewis often said, good trouble. Like generations before us, we find ourselves facing a place of decision. How will we, as a congregation, decide to act at our moment in history? How we answer may impact not only what our congregation becomes, but also what becomes of the larger movement of Unitarian Universalism. When we make such decisions, our choices can have lasting consequences. So may it be. Amen.